Hi there, John McAdams here. Thanks a lot for joining me today as I talk about all of the other 30 caliber cartridges that don't use .308 inch bullets in this episode. As you will see, with just one exception, this episode primarily focuses on cartridges designed outside the USA, like the 303 British, the 7.62 by 39, the 7.5 by 55 millimeter Swiss, etc. So buckle up, folks. This is going to be a good one. Let's get started. We'll start with the smallest caliber cartridge on this list, and that is the 7.5 by 55 millimeter Swiss Schmit-Rubin, also known as the 7.5 by 55 Swiss or the 7.5 Swiss. There are several different versions of this cartridge that have evolved over the years, and this is a theme you'll actually see several times in this episode. But we will focus on the GP11 of the 7.5 Swiss that was adopted in 1911 for right now. Developed for the Swiss military, that load shoots a 174 grain full metal jacket bullet at 2,560 feet per second. That is a Spitzer bullet. It was right at the leading edge of the switch from round nose to Spitzer, or pointed bullets, early in the 20th century. The cartridge itself is 77.7 millimeters long, or 3.06 inches. It has a case 55.6 millimeters long, uses a 7.78 millimeter bullet diameter. That works out to 0.307 inches. Now, this round was primarily used in the Swiss K31 rifle. That is a straight pull action rifle, known actually for being one of the most accurate standard military issue rifles ever produced. They did eventually replace that rifle with the STG-W57 battle rifle in the 1950s. That rifle used the same 7.5 Swiss cartridge. They continued to use that as their primary infantry service rifle for a long time until, I think, the 1990s, when they replaced it with the 5.56 cartridge used in the SIG SG-550 rifle. But this cartridge is still in use. It's basically the Swiss 7.62 by 51 or 308. They still use it in their medium machine guns. Reservists still use some of those older rifles in this chambering, and of course some people hunt with it too. This is a CIP standardized cartridge, 55,000 psi pressure. Like I said, similar in performance to the 308. Norma makes a 180 grain soft point loading at 2690 feet per second, and PPU makes a load with a 174 grain soft point at 2525 feet per second. All right, next we have the 7.62 by 39 millimeter cartridge. Ah, yes, the legendary round used in the AK-47. Also known as the 7.62 short or the 7.62 Soviet, this is possibly the most common centerfire rifle cartridge in the entire world. This cartridge was developed in conjunction with the infamous AK-47 rifle. I've heard over 100 million AKs have been produced since the 1940s, all over the world, and most of those rifles were in the 7.62 by 39 cartridge. Developed as a response to the German STG-44 and 7.92 by 33 millimeter Kurz round during World War II, the AK and the 7.62 by 39 provided Soviet troops with a rifle with a detachable magazine that was capable of fully automatic fire and was chambered in a medium power, medium recoiling cartridge, effective at the intermediate ranges, say out to 300 yards, that troops were most commonly engaging targets at. Now, compared to the older, larger, and more powerful 7.62 by 54R, which we'll talk more about later, the 7.62 by 39 uses a shorter, rimless case that holds less powder and shoots a lighter bullet that's also the same diameter, though, at a slower velocity. There are, of course, several ammo types for each cartridge, but for instance, full-powered 7.62 by 54 R ball ammo is a 148 grain bullet at around 2,800 feet per second. The newer 7.62 by 39 fires a 123 grain bullet at around 2,300 feet per second. So like I said, both bullets are the same diameter, but the 7.62 by 39 is shorter overall and uses a shorter case, 39 millimeters long as opposed to 54 millimeters long for the 7.62 by 54. Now the 7.62 by 39 uses a rimless and highly tapered case to assist with reliable feeding and extraction. Now, the Soviets developed a number of different weapons chambered in this round, like the semi-auto SKS rifle, the RPD machine gun, and, of course, the famous AK-47 assault rifle, and, of course, the many different AK derivatives and clones that have popped up over the ensuing decades as well. In addition to those military rifles, there are also a decent number of hunting rifles available in 7.62 by 39 also, like the Ruger American Ranch, the Ruger Mini 30, the Howa Mini, and there are some ARs actually chambered in this round too. Now, in terms of ammo, there's tons and tons and tons of Full Metal Jacket 7.62 by 39 ammo out there. You can get Full Metal Jacket ammo, of course, from the big American manufacturers, as well as from overseas manufacturers like Red Army Standard, Wolf, Tula, Brown Bear, etc. But I will say those overseas imports, mainly from Russia, are a lot harder and more expensive to find in the USA now than they were a few years ago due to sanctions put on Russia in response to their invasion of Ukraine. Now, in addition to that stuff, there is also a lot of true military surplus 7.62 by 39 ammo out there. For instance, you can find some old Soviet ammo floating around, same with some Chinese Norinco ammo, as well as ammo from the other communist bloc countries. Now, a lot of Americans were on the receiving end of this cartridge over the years, especially in Vietnam, but that round also saw lots and lots of use in Iraq, Afghanistan, lots of other places too. So people tend to have strong opinions on the 7.62 by 39, and many Americans actually have pretty strong negative feelings about it, and I can't blame someone for feeling that way. Within all of that, there's a lot of talk about how effective the 7.62 by 39 is in terms of terminal performance. Some people say the AK bullet will just tumble like crazy on impact and make just ridiculous wounds that are dramatically out of proportion to what you would think from a cartridge that size. That is true sometimes, but not all the time. As I am fond of pointing out, it really depends on the bullet. Now, like I said, there's lots of military surplus ammo out there, and there are several different variations of military surplus ammo that were used by different countries at different times over the years. The original M43 load for the 7.62 by 39 used a boat tail, copper-plated, steel-jacketed bullet that had a steel core. This bullet was very stable, it tended to penetrate very well, and it did not deliver very impressive wound cavities. Now, there was also something called the Type 56 ammo. The Chinese made their own version of the AK-47 that was almost identical, but not exactly the same as the Russian one. They called it the Type 56. This is actually primarily what the Vietnamese used during the Vietnam War against the Americans. There were some true Soviet AK-47s in there as well, but they were mainly using the Type 56 rifle. They also used Type 56 ammo in that rifle that was made in China, and I know it's confusing. This ammo was similar in shape to the M43, also had a mild steel core and a copper-plated steel jacket. Now, this stuff is somewhat common in the USA right now. I actually have some of this Norinco 7.62 by 39 ammo in my hand right now as I'm recording this, and that's actually what I use in all of my photos I post online of the cartridge. But in any case, this is not something that you can normally use at a lot of shooting ranges in the United States. A lot of places will ban steel core ammo because they're afraid of ricochets and because they say it tears up their targets, and they'll test your ammo when you go to the range, potentially by holding a magnet up to it to see if it attracts the magnet, and if it does, then they won't let you use that stuff. In any case, I think this stuff also penetrated pretty well and did not deliver like just crazy wound cavities or anything like that, similar to the M43 ammo. Now, there was another type of ammo, the M67 Yugoslavian ammo, that was different. This used a lead core. This ammo tumbled more readily and made a much more impressive wounding profile. That is the ammo known for making really nasty wounds. And by the way, all of this was Full Metal Jacket military ammo, not hollow point, not soft point. There was a guy named Martin Fackler who was an American Army surgeon who established the Wound Ballistics Laboratory. He was one of the really big pioneers in the field of terminal ballistics. A lot of the concepts and terminology that we use today discussing terminal ballistics came from him. In any case, he worked for the U.S. Army for a long time studying terminal ballistics and published some studies demonstrating the different terminal effects produced by different cartridges in use by different militaries of the world at the time, as well as different loads. And there's a chart that floats around out there sometimes that you can probably find showing the different wound profiles produced by these different 7.62 by 39 loads. Now, that's all well and good and everything. I don't recommend hunting with Full Metal Jacket ammo, and it's actually illegal in many places. But you're not limited to using Full Metal Jacket or Milsurp ammo. Nope, there are actually some decent commercial ammo offerings that are much better suited for hunting for this cartridge. Remington actually makes a core lock load for the 7.62 by 39, 125 grain bullet at 2365 feet per second. Federal makes a Power Shock, exact same bullet weight and velocity. Winchester makes ammo for the cartridge in their Deer Season XP and PowerPoint lines, both 123 grain bullets. Deer Season at 2380, PowerPoint at 2365. Hornady makes a load for it with a 123 grain SST at 2350. They also make a load in their subsonic line with a 255 grain Sub X bullet and a 111 grain Monoflex SBR bullet too. Nosler also makes ammo for the 7.62 by 39 in their E-tip, Varmageddon, and ballistic tip lines. All those loads use a 123 grain bullet at 2,350 feet per second. The 7.62 by 39 is similar in performance to the 30-30, but it tends to use lighter pointed bullets, right? Everything I just talked about was in the 120 to 125 grain range. Well, you compare that to a 30-30 that is using, say, 150 to 170 grain bullets, often flat-tipped or round-nose bullets for the 30-30. It's also a little bit less powerful than the 30-32. It's shooting a bullet that's a little bit lighter at a similar velocity. It also has a different bore diameter than the 30-32. The 30-30 uses .308 caliber bullets. The 7.62 by 39 tends to use larger .310 or .312 inch bullets. SAMI spec for the cartridge is a .310 inch bullet or 7.9 millimeters. CIP spec is 7.92 millimeters, which is .3118 rounded up to .312 inches. 45,000 psi max SAMI average pressure, 51,490 max average pressure from CIP. All in all, this is a great cartridge for stuff like deer, hogs, things like that at shorter range. It's not a super powerful cartridge, but it is powerful enough. And the cartridge got a bad reputation for accuracy. I really think that is more a function of people using real low quality, cheap ammo and a real cheap rifle more than anything else. This is one of those cartridges that you put it in a nicer rifle like that Howa or one of the Rugers or something, and you use good commercially produced hunting ammo in it, and it will shoot much more accurately than some would have you believe. This is a low velocity round that's best for use at shorter range. Like I said, 200 yards and in, thereabouts, so it's not a super long range cartridge, but it is darn effective inside that ideal performance window. Recoil isn't too bad either. I've never killed anything with a 7.62 by 39, but I've shot it a lot. Certainly recoils more than something like a 5.56 or a 2.23, but still not bad. It's even less than a 30-30, which isn't bad in and of itself. A friend of mine in Lufkin has actually killed a couple of deer and hogs with an AK clone in 7.62 by 39. Results were very impressive in each case. Okay, now let's talk about another Russian and Soviet cartridge, the 7.62 by 54R. This is basically the Russian 30-06. Not literally, of course, but this was their primary infantry service rifle cartridge for most of the first half of the 20th century. It is a completely different design, but similar to the 30-06 in power, especially those older 30-06 loads from the early 20th century. And like the 30-06, not only did the military use it, but many hunters have used it as well. The Russian Empire adopted this cartridge in 1891 with their M1891 Mosin Nagant rifle, aka the 3-line rifle. 1 line equals 1/10 of an inch, so a 3-line rifle is a 30 caliber rifle. For some reason, that's how the Russians describe their rifles. In any case, 7.62x54 is a rimmed cartridge. Overall length 3.048 inches, 53.7 millimeter long case, or 2.115 inches. This is another one of those in-between rounds. A little shorter than a 30-06, a little longer than a 308. This is also another one of those cartridges where different rifles sometimes have different bore diameters, depending on who made it, what sort of condition the rifle is in, that sort of thing. CIP standard for the cartridge is a 7.92 millimeter bullet, which is 0.3118 inches. This is a CIP but not SAMI standardized cartridge. Maximum average pressure, according to CIP, of 56,500 psi. This is actually one of the very few rimmed cartridges still in common use. So it keeps company with rounds like the 30-30 and the 45-70. The 7.62x54 originally shot 210 grain round nose full metal jacket bullets at around 2,200 feet per second. The Russians changed over to a Spitzer, or pointed bullet, in the early 1900s, around the same time most other countries were making that same switch. Typical military load for the 7.62x54R is a 148 grain full metal jacket bullet at 2,800 feet per second. There are several different loads out there, though, and you'll get different velocities for each of them depending on the barrel length of the weapon they're fired from, so just take that as a generalized performance spec. This round is heavily associated with the Mosin Nagant rifle, and the Russians and eventually the Soviets and eventually lots of other countries used various different versions of that rifle for many, many, many decades after the Russians first introduced it in the 1890s. Believe it or not, Winchester actually made model 1895 rifles in 7.62x54R for service with the Russian Empire. Same thing with Remington and their rolling block rifle. In addition to the Nagant and those two rifles, the Russian military also used it in their PKM machine gun. We called that the perfect killing machine in Afghanistan. They also used it in their SVD sniper rifle. And it's actually still in service with the Russian military to this day. This round has been in service longer than any other round. Right, the Russians and the Soviets both used it during World War I and World War II. It was also used all over the communist bloc in the ensuing decades. The same was also true for any country that received military aid from the Soviet Union at one point or another. I encountered this rifle, usually in terrible condition, in both Iraq and Afghanistan. This is one of those weapons that saw use on both sides of many wars and conflicts too. And I'm sure there are probably some Nagant rifles being used by the Russians, say the Russian reservists in Ukraine or in the Syrian civil war, things like that. This cartridge is much more commonly used today in machine guns than anything else. But the Russians and the Soviets got a lot of mileage out of those Nagant rifles. A North Korean soldier armed with a Nagant rifle in this chambering actually shot my grandfather in the face with a 148 grain full metal jacket in 1950 during the Korean War. Now, the Nagant was a very long rifle, had a very long barrel. There were different versions of this rifle that had barrels of different lengths, but the normal longer infantry service rifle, I think, had a barrel that was 29 inches long. And that's really long. He was involved in some of the initial fighting in the first couple months of the Korean War as the Americans were retreating towards Pusan. And he told me many years later he was involved in a local counterattack trying to stabilize the Pusan perimeter in August of 1950. The North Koreans had attacked either the previous day or earlier in that day, pushed the Americans out of these positions. The Americans regrouped, counterattacked, tried to take their old spots back from the Koreans. He said as they were advancing on this hill, they could see all of these rifle barrels sticking up out of foxholes dotting the side of the hill. As they got closer, they would notice those rifle barrels start to wiggle as the North Korean soldier would stand up out of the foxhole and bring his rifle out to start shooting at the Americans. So what he said that he was doing, he was carrying a fully automatic M2 carbine at the time. He would watch, see when one of those rifle barrels would start to wiggle. He would stop, take aim at that foxhole, and fire a burst from his carbine at it. Then he would start running at the hill again after he fired that burst. And he did this a couple of times, and then all of a sudden he felt the ground coming up towards him, and he woke up in a hospital sometime later. Like I said, a bullet hit him in the face, blew out all of his teeth, knocked him unconscious, but he was fortunately not very badly injured otherwise. But if you ever hear me talk about the story of my grandfather getting shot in the head and telling people not to whine because he said the only time he ever had a headache was that time he was shot in the head, that's the background with that story. He was a darn lucky man, though, and a tiny bit of variation in almost any direction where that bullet hit him could have been curtains for him. I mentioned the CIP standard bullet diameter for this cartridge of 7.92 millimeters earlier. While that is true, you'll still potentially see some variation in bullet diameters. I'm going to read a blurb from Cartridges of the World for you. Although military bullets measure .309 to .311 inch in diameter, rifles with tighter bores will shoot .308 inch bullets just fine. However, many rifles have grossly oversized bores. In such rifles, .308 inch jacketed bullets are hopelessly inaccurate, though .311 inch bullets will shoot with a modicum of accuracy. Properly sized cast bullets will shoot with impressive accuracy. Minute of angle groups are no problem. Unfortunately, there is no ready source of appropriate commercial jacketed or cast bullet size large enough for specimens with bores running larger than about .313 inches. End of quote. This cartridge has a reputation for so-so accuracy and terrible recoil. Both of those things are more likely a function of the design of the rifles with that flat steel butt pad in terms of recoil, which should otherwise be on par with about a 30-06. And, like I just mentioned, accuracy can obviously be dramatically affected by using the wrong bullet size in your chamber. So things are just kind of all over the place with this cartridge. Now, like the 7.62x39, you can get full metal jacket and even military surplus ammo for this round. But you can also get commercially produced hunting ammo too. For instance, PPU makes a load with a 150 grain soft point at 2,840 feet per second. S&B makes a load with a 180 grain soft point at just over 2,600 feet per second. Winchester also makes a 180 grain soft point at about the same velocity, 26-25 feet per second. So even though there isn't a tremendous variety of purpose-built hunting ammo for it, there are some options out there, and it would work just fine if you found something that works well in your rifle and shoots accurately. I will close with a quote from Art Alphen from his book, Any Shot You Want. I certainly would not go out of my way recommending someone buy an M91 rifle. However, they are plentiful and very cheap. If one wants a rugged rifle for throwing into the bed of a pickup truck, or for knocking around in the brush, the rifle and cartridge would certainly be a candidate. Properly hand-loaded, it is easily capable of doing whatever a 300 Savage or a 308 Winchester can do. End of quote. Now we will move on to the 7.62x53R. This round is very similar, but actually a little bit different from the 7.62x54R. They are both distinct rounds with CIP. The 7.62x54R is a Russian cartridge. The 7.62x53R is a Finnish cartridge. There is a heavy Russian influence on Finland. It actually used to be part of the Russian Empire. With this in mind, the Finns will often take Russian rifles and make their own spin on them. And they'll usually be very similar to, but often slightly higher quality than what you're getting out of Russia. Now, in this case, they did that with a cartridge as well. My book, Cartridges of the World, says the 7.62 by 53 and 54R are the same. And for all intents and purposes, they are. Lapua makes ammo that will function in rifles for either chambering. I heard the Russian company Barnhall does the same too. If you look at the CIP specs, there are very slight differences in their maximum overall length, their case length, rim diameter, and even bullet diameter. But these are very, very small differences. For all intents and purposes, though, like I said, delivers almost identical performance to the 7.62 by 54R, and this cartridge was designed for use in the Finnish take on the Mauser Nagant. The Finnish military continues to use this cartridge in some of their sniper rifles and machine guns. Next, we'll talk about the 7.65 by 53 Argentine Mauser. Designed in 1889 for the Belgian Mauser, this cartridge was also used by Argentina and several other countries in South and Central America and elsewhere in the world. Winchester actually loaded 7.65 by 53 ammo for a while. They even made a very small number of their pre-World War II Model 70s in this chambering too. My Winchester handbook says they made a grand total of 31 Model 70s in 7.65 Mauser. Winchester did make a larger number of their Model 54s in this caliber. Remington also made it in their Model 30 rifle. In addition to those three American rifles, various military surplus Mauser rifles are the most common specimens you'll find in 7.65 Argentine Mauser. Most common single rifle, probably the Model 1891 Argentine Mauser or the Model 1909 Argentine Mauser. My cousin actually has a Model 1891 Argentine Mauser. This cartridge is 76 millimeters long, or 2.99 inches, uses a 53.6 millimeter case, 7.94 millimeter bullet diameter. That's 0.3125 inches, according to the CIP standards. This is a rimless cartridge, slightly longer overall, and has a slightly longer case than the 308, but it is loaded to a slightly lower pressure. 56,500 PSI with CIP. It's a CIP but not SAMI standardized cartridge. The 308 is loaded to 60,190 PSI according to CIP standards. Cartridges of the World had the following to say about it. The 7.65 millimeter is among the best designed of all Mauser cartridges. It provides excellent performance for North American hunting. In power, its slightly larger usable case capacity and slight bore size increase place it ahead of the 308 Winchester and quite close to factory 30-06 loads, especially with bullets up to about 165 grains, which makes it adequate for all medium game. End of quote. PPU makes a load with a 180 grain soft point at 2,545 feet per second. Norma offers 7.65 ammo in their whitetail line with a 174 grain bullet at 2,423 feet per second. Now, the next three cartridges are all very similar in power and were actually used by three different countries during World War II. Now, the first is the 303 British, and while it was used by the British during World War II, it's a lot of use outside of that conflict. I described the 7.62 by 54R as the Russian 30-06. Well, the 303 British is the British 30-06. Adopted in 1888, this is the cartridge of the British Empire. It served in the hands of British and Commonwealth soldiers during the Boer War. It's the origin of Rule 303. If you know, you know. They also used it, of course, in World War I and World War II, and basically up until the British replaced it with the 7.62 by 51 millimeter cartridge in the 1950s. Like the 7.62 by 54R, the 303 British is a rimmed cartridge. 3.075 inch overall length, 2.222 inch case length. Uses a shallow 17-degree shoulder, has a pretty highly tapered case as well. Not quite as tapered as something like a 375 H&H, but more tapered than, say, a 30-06. Now, like the 7.62x39, the 303 British is standardized both with SAMI and with CIP. SAMI spec bullet diameter is 0.3125 inches or 7.938 millimeters. CIP spec bullet diameter is 7.92 millimeters or 0.3118 inches. And once again, since this cartridge has been around for so darn long, and there were rifles made at different places, at different times, that have been taken care of to varying degrees and are of varying quality now, different rifles are going to have slightly different bore diameters in them too. But it doesn't seem like there's nearly as big of a variation in bore diameter for the 303 British rifles as was the case with the 7.62x54R. Now, the 303 British was originally used in the Lee Metford rifle. It was also used in the Lee Enfield rifle adopted in 1895 that replaced the Lee Metford. Now, this cartridge is primarily associated with the Lee Enfield rifle, and if someone says they have a 303 rifle, it is probably a Lee Enfield. Initial loading was a 215-grain round-nose bullet pushed by 70 grains of black powder for 1,850 feet per second. That load delivered great penetration, but not very impressive wounding capacity. Right? It would just punch straight through animals and people without doing too much else. This obviously could present a problem sometimes, so British military designers eventually came up with what we would now describe as an expanding bullet that was full metal jacket up to a point but had an exposed lead tip at the nose. They developed this bullet at the Dum Dum Arsenal in India. Known as the Dum Dum bullet, this projectile produced much more fearsome wounds on people. But German protests about the effectiveness of this bullet on people led to the Hague Convention of 1899, which prohibited future use of expanding bullets in international warfare between signatories of the Hague Convention. So if you ever are curious why military forces normally use just a straight full metal jacket bullet, it's because of the Hague Convention, not the Geneva Convention. It's a common misconception. It is the Hague Convention. The Dum Dum bullet developed for the 303 British is one of the things that spurred that agreement. Now, the British eventually switched over from black powder to cordite for the 303 British, continued using that old round-nose bullet for a while, just at a faster velocity, and then in 1910, they updated the round again to use a 174-grain pointed flat-based bullet. That one had a muzzle velocity of 2,440 feet per second. Just like I described with the 7.5 Swiss and the 7.62x54R, this occurred in the early 1900s during that trend away from real heavy round-nose bullets towards lighter pointed bullets going faster. The British called this the Mark 7 round, and it still used a full metal jacket bullet, but they made a very important change. It had a rear lead core, but the front of the projectile was filled with either aluminum, wood, or fiber inside the copper jacket. This resulted in a bullet that was very stable in flight, but would quickly become unstable and tumble upon impact, sort of like the M67 7.62x39 load I referred to earlier. This bullet was still compliant with the Hague Convention, but it exhibited much improved wounding capacity. Now, it did not penetrate nearly as well due to the tendency to yaw upon impact. It worked great on humans and on smaller game, but was not quite as effective on larger game due to the erratic penetration as a result of the bullet tumbling. Now, the 303 British is just a little bit less powerful than the 308 Winchester. It's one of these cartridges that is slightly larger overall, but loaded to a lower pressure. Both are SAMI-spec cartridges. 303 British, 49,000 psi max pressure versus 62,000 psi for the 308. Even so, it's a capable cartridge on medium game with the right bullets. Now, Kevin Robertson actually told a story, I think in episode 206 with me, about Don Heath killing a Cape Buffalo bull and discovering that it had a 303 British full metal jacket projectile embedded in its heart. And the bull was still alive, acting completely healthy, so that wound had completely healed. But that just goes to show what can happen with this cartridge if you use the wrong bullets in it. A lot of people in Africa hunted and killed game with full metal jacketed 303 projectiles, and it worked because that's all they had, but there are many better choices for that sort of work now. To that end, John Taylor had the following to say about the 303 British, and he was specifically talking about hunting with military surplus full metal jacket ammo in Africa. A lot of game has been killed with this cartridge, but a lot has been wounded and lost. Anyway, it's prohibited now throughout the greater part of Africa north of the Zambezi. End of quote. In terms of factory ammo, Hornady makes a load with a 150 grain interlock at 2,685 feet per second. S&B makes a 150 grain soft point load at a similar velocity. They also make a 180 grain load at just under 2,400 feet per second. Remington makes 303 British ammo in their core lock line, 180 grain core lock at 2,460 feet per second. Winchester makes 303 British ammo in their PowerPoint line, exact same ballistics as the core lock. Federal offers 2 power shock loads for the 303 British, a 150 grain power shock at almost 2,700 feet per second, and a 180 grain power shock at 2,460 feet per second. In terms of rifles, there are lots and lots and lots of old surplus British Enfield rifles out there. In fact, the Canadian Rangers actually used Enfield rifles up until very recently. This cartridge, those rifles are very common in all of the Commonwealth nations, right? Canada, Australia, various African countries, etc. Somewhat common in the USA as well. A good number of surplus rifles found their way over here. I've shot Enfield rifles a bunch over the years, and they're a lot of fun to shoot with. I encountered a few Enfields in Afghanistan too, including an Enfield with number 1 Mark III markings. I'm pretty certain that rifle was a Khyber Pass copy though. The 303 British also served as the basis for several Wildcat cartridges. In Australia, the 303-22 and the 303-25 are somewhat common, and they're the 303 British neck down to 22 and 25 caliber respectively. While I was in South Africa in 2023 on my most recent podcast hunt, I found an expended 6mm Musgrave casing in the road, in the dirt. And the 6mm Musgrave was a cartridge made by PMP in South Africa, and it was basically a 303 British neck down to 6mm. That was a very popular cartridge for hunting game like springbok in that part of Africa for a while. All in all, awesome cartridge. Very easy to see why it is still such a favorite all over the world. Next, we have the 7.5 by 54 Mas. This was a French rimless military cartridge adopted in 1929 to replace the 8mm Lebel. The French chambered their new Mas 36 rifle for 7.5 by 54 in 1936. The French used it in World War II and, of course, in the aftermath of the war, until they replaced it with the 7.62 by 51 and the 5.56 by 45 in the 1970s and 80s. This cartridge has a 54mm long case, 2.992 inch overall length, shoots 0.3086 inch or 0.784 millimeter projectiles. CIP lists 55,000 psi as its maximum average pressure. Cartridges of the World lists a 140 grain full metal jacket bullet at 2,600 feet per second as the standard French military load. I've also heard 2,700 feet per second for the muzzle velocity on that cartridge. PPU does make a load for it now with 139 grain full metal jacket at 2,600 feet per second. So this cartridge is a bit less powerful than the 308. It's also not a super common cartridge. I have heard the French tended to hang on to their old military surplus rifles for a long time. So in contrast to the 303 or the 7.62 by 54, not too many of these French rifles have made it into civilian hands. But you could use this round for anything you would use a 308 on, though. All right, next we have the 7.7 by 58 millimeter Japanese Arisaka round. This was the other primary Japanese military cartridge from World War II. Now, the Japanese actually used two different rifles in two different cartridges during the war. The first was the Type 38 rifle in 6.5 by 50 millimeter. The second was the Type 99 in 7.7 by 58. Now, lots of Japanese Arisaka rifles found their way into the USA at the end of World War II. Naturally, those who ended up with those rifles wanted to shoot them, but actual 6.5 millimeter and 7.7 millimeter Japanese ammo was darn near impossible to find at the time. Now, I mentioned the 6.5 257 was developed with the 257 Roberts as a parent case as an alternative to the 6.5 millimeter Japanese ammo back in episode 328, where I talk about all of the 25 caliber cartridges. Now, as far as I know, only Type 99 rifles were chambered in the 7.7 millimeter Arisaka cartridge. Some of those rifles were rechambered to 300 Savage or 30-06 in the USA after World War II, but a lot of them are still hanging around in the original 7.7 millimeter chambering. A quick look on Gunbroker will reveal there are plenty of them still out there, and oftentimes they're not that expensive either. Now, sometimes you run into a Type 99 that has been sporterized one way or another. Sometimes it has a different stock or a scope mount on it or whatever. Some are more or less originals. Now, many of those rifles have had the chrysanthemum stamp ground off or defaced. That was the symbol of the Japanese royal family. All of the Japanese military rifles had a chrysanthemum stamp on them. Those that are still in really good shape, that have not been sporterized, and that still have the chrysanthemum stamp, also known as a mum stamp on them, are more expensive. Sometimes you will run into so-called last-ditch 99 rifles that were produced later in World War II. The Germans did this sort of thing as well with some of their Mausers they made right at the end of World War II. In both cases, the rifles are pretty low quality, sometimes almost of dangerous quality. And especially in the case of the Type 99, those last-ditch rifles contributed to the reputation of the rifle as being a piece of junk in the eyes of some people. But the earlier production rifles are, of course, much better. I have heard that P.O. Ackley actually did a test, I think in the 1950s, to see which military rifles had the strongest action, where he just loaded a case hotter and hotter and hotter and continued to do that until he blew the action of the rifle up. I've heard the Arisaka won that quote-unquote competition and lasted longer than the Mausers, Enfields, Springfields, those rifles did. Now, even the earlier production Type 99s weren't known for being super-duper accurate, but they were certainly accurate enough to get the job done, and they are accurate enough if you have a rifle that's in good shape for you to hunt with. Now, it actually may be surprising, but the British had a close relationship with Japan in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They were actually allies during World War I. The British exerted strong influence on the Japanese military during that time frame, and they actually sold them a lot of weapons too. Even after the Japanese started producing their own military hardware, all of that stuff still showed a lot of British influence. So the 7.7 by 58 millimeter Arisaka has basically the same ballistics as the 303 British, but it just uses a rimless case, has the same bullet diameter, and fires a bullet of a similar weight at a similar velocity. Norma actually makes 7.7 Arisaka ammo as part of their whitetail line. They have one load with a 174 grain soft point fired at 2,500 feet per second. Now, as long as you can sort things out with the rifle and get one that's in good shape, that's safe to use, shoots accurately, all of that stuff, you can use that Norma ammo and It can be a very capable hunting cartridge. There's just that logistical problem that there is with some of these cartridges sometimes. Okay, now let's talk about the last cartridge of this episode, the 3220 Winchester. This cartridge was introduced by Winchester in 1882 for their 1873 lever-action rifle. This round was somewhat popular as a rifle and revolver cartridge for a time. In addition to Winchester, Colt, Smith & Wesson, Bayard, Marlin, and Remington made firearms for it. Now remember, the model 1873 Winchester used pistol cartridges like the 4440. One of the appeals of that way of doing things was a person could have a lever-action rifle and a revolver that used the same ammunition. Well, that was the case with the 3220. Now, I'm not sure why Winchester called it the 3220 because it uses .312-inch bullets. SAMI spec is .3125 inches for it. Same with CIP. So it's not really a 32 caliber cartridge at all. It's a little bit bigger than usual 30 caliber cartridge. This is a very low pressure black powder round. It was actually not tested with the transducer, used the crusher test only with SAMI, and they have it rated at 16,000 copper units of pressure. You compare that to 45,000 CUP for the 303 British and 52,000 for the 308. Even the 4570 is 28,000 CUP. Winchester marketed the 3220 as a crossover varmint and deer cartridge. It works fine for varmints. It is on the light side for deer, though you could get it to work in a pinch. So this is a low velocity round shooting light bullets. Winchester produces a load now for the 3220 with a 100 grain lead flat nose bullet at 1,210 feet per second for a whopping 325 foot-pounds of energy. This cartridge is still hanging around out there. You can get one of those older rifles I just mentioned. You could also get it in a single-shot Thompson Center pistol, too. And the 3220 was also the parent case of the 2520 Winchester and the 218B. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel right now and hit that like button. Just click on the thumbs up button and the red subscribe button below the video so you don't miss out on any of my new videos. Be sure you check out my playlist of the other all-encompassing caliber roll-ups I have done on different bore sizes in the past, like 25 caliber, 270 caliber, and 33 caliber cartridges. I've also put links below the video to articles I have written about some of my favorite pieces of hunting gear, like slings, ear protection, and scopes. Now, for more detailed information on popular hunting cartridges and what they are best suited for, click on the link in the description below or go to thebiggamehuntingblog.com/ebook. Sign up there to get a free ebook I have written on the best hunting calibers. Now I'm going to turn it over to you. Have you hunted with any of these 30 caliber cartridges? If so, which ones? Which game have you taken with them? What rifle and ammo did you use in each